In the spring of 1870, a federal marshal riding solo through the Choctaw Nation came across 17 bodies laid out in a perfect ring around a dying campfire. Each man had been shot once, right between the eyes, and each cold hand held a single playing card from the same deck. The marshal counted the cards twice before grasping what he was seeing. The dead included Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, bounty hunters, and 3 deputies from his own office in Fort Smith, Arkansas. These were men who had ridden out together 6 weeks earlier with one mission: to capture or kill the man the papers had started calling the Black Devil of the Red River. Like every posse before them, they had failed, and the cards in their hands spelled out a message in a code the marshal recognized, but could not read. A code that would remain unbroken for another 41 years. Long after everyone who understood its meaning was dead and buried in unmarked graves scattered across 3 states and the Indian Territory. What the marshal didn't know, what no white lawman would understand for decades, was that the man they were hunting had once been property, sold at auction in Natchez, Mississippi, for $940 to a cotton planter who branded him on the left shoulder with the initials J.W. before sending him into the fields at age 11. Before we continue with the story of Jeremiah Walker and the gang that nearly brought the United States government to its knees in the years after the Civil War, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from tonight, because what you're about to hear was buried in classified federal records for over a century, and the descendants of the men involved are still alive in towns from Oklahoma to East Texas. They never wanted this story told. Tonight, we're going to tell it anyway, to understand how a former slave came to lead the most feared outlaw band in the history of the American frontier. You first have to understand the country that produced him, a country that had just torn itself apart over the question of whether men like him were human beings or merchandise. The war ended in April of 1865, but along the western edge of the former Confederacy, in the borderlands where Texas met the Indian Territory and the Indian Territory met Arkansas, the war didn't end at all. It just changed form. The Union Army pulled most of its troops out to occupy the deeper South, leaving behind a vast, lawless region nearly the size of France, policed by fewer than 200 federal lawmen. Into that vacuum poured every desperate creature the war had created. Confederate guerrillas who refused to surrender, Union deserters wanted for murder in 3 states, Comanche and Kiowa raiders pushed off their hunting grounds, Mexican vaqueros displaced by new Anglo cattle barons, Chinese laborers who'd finished the railroads and found themselves friendless in a country that hated them, and tens of thousands of freedmen, emancipated with nowhere to go and nothing to their names, walking west in the clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. The town of Boggy Depot sat near the center of this chaos, in the Choctaw Nation about 40 miles north of the Red River. And in the autumn of 1866, it was the kind of place where a man could buy a meal, a horse, or another man's life for roughly the same price. The streets were unpaved, and the buildings were thrown together from green cottonwood that warped and split as it dried, giving every door and window an uneven look, as if the town had been built by a drunk who couldn't remember how houses were supposed to fit together. There were 3 saloons, 2 of them owned by the same Choctaw merchant named Pushmataha Folsom, a descendant of a famous chief who'd grown rich selling whiskey to soldiers during the war and saw no reason to stop selling it to outlaws now that the soldiers had gone home. There was a single store run by a Scottish trader named Angus McRae, who kept a loaded shotgun under the counter and a Bible on top of it, and who was known to settle disputes with whichever of the two he found closer to hand. There was a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a small adobe building that served as both jail and courthouse for whatever rough justice the Choctaw Lifeless police could administer when they bothered to ride through, which was less and less often as the country fell deeper into disorder. Boggy Depot that autumn wasn't so much a town as a wound that had begun to scar over without healing properly underneath. Wagons rolled in at all hours from the south, from Texas, carrying men who wouldn't give their names, and goods no one would ask the provenance of. Wagons rolled out at all hours toward the north, toward Fort Smith, carrying things that had once belonged to other people. The graveyard at the edge of town, on a small rise behind the Methodist mission abandoned since 1863, had grown by 47 new graves in the 18 months since the war ended. Only 9 of them belonged to people who died of natural causes. The rest had died, as the saying went in that country, of lead poisoning, or rope fever, or the kind of accident involving a knife, a back, and a moonless night. The Choctaw Lifeless Police, a small body of mounted lawmen authorized by treaty to keep order in the nation, had ridden through twice in the year before, both times after killings serious enough to embarrass the tribal government in Tuscaloosa. Both times they'd questioned a few witnesses, found nothing, and ridden away again, leaving Boggy Depot to settle its own accounts in its own way. The mission building still stood at the western edge of town, its roof half collapsed, the heavy oak doors hanging open. Inside, the town's children and the children of passing strangers played among the broken pews and the smashed pulpit, occasionally finding a torn page of a hymnal or a fragment of a colored window someone had thought worth shooting at. The smell of the town was a particular smell anyone who'd spent time in such places would have recognized: horse manure, wood smoke, unwashed wool, and cheap whiskey. And beneath all of that, the faint but persistent smell of old blood that had soaked into the earth of certain alleys and wouldn't be washed out by any amount of rain. Into this town on a cold November morning in 1866 walked a black man of about 20 years old, 6'2", lean as a coyote, wearing a Union Army cavalry coat, with the chevrons of a corporal still stitched to the sleeve, and a wide, brimmed slouch hat pulled low over eyes the color of wet slate. He carried a Spencer repeating carbine slung across his back, 2 Colt Army revolvers at his hips in a cross, draw rig he'd cut himself from harness leather, and a Bowie knife in his right boot. He had no horse. He'd walked the last 60 miles from the Texas border through country where a black man traveling alone was generally considered fair game for anyone who wanted his weapons or his life. He hadn't been bothered. The reasons why would become clear to the people of Boggy Depot in the months to come. His name, he told Angus McCrae when he came into the store to buy salt pork and coffee, was Jeremiah Walker. He'd served 3 years in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, been at the Battle of Honey Springs, been wounded twice, and been mustered out at Fort Leavenworth in 1865 with a discharge paper, a bounty voucher the Army had refused to honor, and the brand of his former owner still legible on his left shoulder. McCrae looked him over once, saw the way Walker stood with his back to the corner of the store and his eyes on the door, recognized the look of a man who had decided long ago that he would never be taken alive, and counted out the goods without comment. He even threw in a small bag of dried apples. Years later, when McCrae was an old man and most of the people in this story were dead, he told a journalist from St. Louis that he'd known from the moment Walker walked into his store that the country was about to change, though he had no way of guessing how much. The pieces of Walker's early life that have been recovered mostly through the patient work of black historians at Howard University in the 1930s and 40s. Paint a picture of a childhood designed to break a human being and somehow producing, through some combination of accident and ferocious will, the opposite. He'd been born in 1846 on a cotton plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, the property of a planter named Josiah Whittington, who owned roughly 200 enslaved people and ran his operation on what he'd scientific principles. That meant he'd read the agricultural journals of the period and concluded them maximized by breaking slave families apart and selling the children when they reached working age. On the theory that workless attachments were less educated and more like historic texts, and more focused on theirs, and rates amount of this more focused limit to build on like life is reduced. Walker's mother, whose name in the plantation ledgers was given only as Hannah, had been sold south to Louisiana when Jeremiah was 9. He never saw her again. His father, whose identity Walker himself never knew with certainty, was probably a free blacksmith from Natchez who'd been allowed brief visits to the plantation under tightly controlled conditions and who disappeared from local records in 1853, possibly murdered, possibly fled. At 11, Walker was sold to a cotton planter in northern Louisiana, the man whose initials would be burned into his shoulder, and who treated him with a casual brutality that was, by the standards of the time and place, neither unusual nor noteworthy. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 during the chaos of the early war and made his way north through the Mississippi swamps to Union lines, where he was eventually directed to a recruiting station in Kansas that was enlisting black soldiers for what would become the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. He served with distinction for 3 years. He learned to read in the regimental school, taught by a Quaker chaplain from Pennsylvania, who would later remember him in a published memoir as the most quietly intelligent young man the chaplain had ever encountered, with a memory that retained everything and an instinct for tactical situations that would have made him a senior officer in any army that allowed black men to wear officers' insignia. The Union Army did not allow this. Walker was discharged as a corporal, having been recommended for promotion to sergeant on 3 separate occasions and denied each time on grounds that the regulations of the period prohibited. What happened over the next 18 months in the territory between the Red River and the Canadian River is documented in pieces in the records of the Choctaw Light Horse, in the dispatches of the federal marshals at Fort Smith, in the private correspondence of Texas cattlemen, and in the oral histories that black families in eastern Oklahoma still tell their children. Though now they tell them quietly, because the descendants of those who hunted Jeremiah Walker still live in those same counties, and old grudges in that country have a way of outliving the men who first conceived them. By the spring of 1868, Walker had assembled around him a band of men, so improbable in its composition that federal authorities at first refused to believe the reports they were receiving. There were 7 black freedmen, all former Union soldiers like Walker himself, including a Tennessee man named Cass's Pettigrew, who'd been a regimental scout and could read sign on Bear Rock. There were 4 Comanche warriors led by a man called Tabananica, whose name meant Sound of the Sun, who had lost his entire family to a Texas Ranger raid in 1864 and saw the new alliance as a continuation of his war against white settlers by other means. There were 3 Mexican brothers from the Nueces Strip, Ignacio, Reverend, and Severino Quintanilla, whose father had been hanged by Anglo vigilantes during the so-called Cart War, and who brought with them the brutal efficiency of borderland feuds. There were 2 white men, both Confederate guerrillas, who had ridden with William Quantrill and had no place left in the post-war world a Missourian named Ellis Tatum, and a Kentuckian named Calvin H. Hutton. There was an old Choctaw freedman named Solomon Beams, who had been the slave of a Choctaw planter before the war, and now served the band as cook, scout, and unofficial diplomat with the 5 civilized tribes. And there was a woman, which the federal records found particularly difficult to accept, a black woman of perhaps 25 named Delia Ransom, who had escaped a Louisiana plantation at 15 and spent the war years working as a laundress for a Union cavalry regiment, where she learned to handle a pistol with both hands and to read maps with the quick instinct of a born tactician. She rode with the band as an equal, planned several of its most successful raids, and was, according to the only surviving photograph of her, a woman of striking and severe beauty, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to be focused on something 100 yards beyond whatever was actually in front of her. The gang did not steal cattle, which is what made them dangerous. Cattle thieves were a known quantity in the territory, easily organized against, easily hunted down by cattlemen's associations and the newly formed stock detective agencies. What Jeremiah Walker's band stole was money, in quantities no frontier outlaw had previously imagined possible. Their first major operation, in April of 1868, was the robbery of a payroll wagon belonging to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, which was attempting to push its line west across the Indian Territory. The wagon was carrying 28 Zellhosers in Union greenbacks intended to pay the railroad's construction crews. It was guarded by 12 armed men, including 4 Pinkerton agents brought in specifically because the railroad anticipated trouble. The wagon was struck at 300 in the morning by a force the surviving guards estimated at 30 riders, though Walker's entire band never numbered more than 20. The attack was over in less than 4 minutes. 3 guards were killed, including 2 of the Pinkertons. The rest were stripped of their weapons and tied to trees. The money was loaded onto pack mules and carried east into the Kiamichi Mountains, where it disappeared into a network of caves the Choctaw freedmen had used as hiding places during the war. None of it was ever recovered. The surviving guards, when they were eventually able to give coherent statements at Fort Smith, spoke of an attack that didn't feel like an attack at all. There had been no shouted demands, no warning shots, no announcement of intentions. There had been, instead, a sudden silence, the kind of silence that drops on a forest when a predator has entered it. The silence of every small animal holding its breath at once. The 2 lead horses pulling the wagon had collapsed simultaneously, killed by what proved on examination to be 2 perfectly placed rifle shots fired from a distance of more than 300 yards by marksmen the guards never saw. Then the riders had emerged from the timber on both sides of the road, riding at a slow walk, their faces covered with dark cloth, their guns held at the ready, but not pointed at anyone in particular. The way a man holds a gun when he is so certain of his ability to use it that he sees no need to threaten. 3 of the guards, including the senior Pinkerton, attempted to draw their weapons. They were shot dead before their hands completed the movement. By riders no one saw aim. The other guards raised their hands. They were ordered. In a calm voice one of them later described as sounding like a country schoolteacher giving instructions to a particularly slow class. To dismount, remove their gun belts, walk to designated trees, and put their wrists together behind the trunks. They complied. They were tied with cord that had been cut to exactly the right length in advance. They were searched, and any small valuables on their persons, watches, rings, small amounts of personal cash, were pointedly left untouched. Only the railroad money. The company money was taken. One of the guards, a young Pinkerton from Pennsylvania on his first Western assignment, began to cry. One of the masked riders dismounted, walked over to him, and offered him a sip from a flask of whiskey. The young man accepted. The rider patted him on the shoulder, returned to his horse, and rode away. By the time a passing freight wagon found them at dawn, the guards had been tied to their trees for nearly 5 hours. The only thing any of them could agree on with certainty was that the men who had attacked them had not been ordinary outlaws. They had been, one guard said, soldiers, the kind who had survived the war by becoming better at killing than the people trying to kill them, and then had decided, for reasons no one understood, to keep going. What disturbed the Pinkerton Agency more than the loss of the money was the discovery, when the surviving guards were untied, that each of them had been tagged with a small piece of paper pinned to his shirt. The papers all said the same thing, in a careful schoolmaster's hand. We could have killed you. We chose not to. Tell your masters that the next time, the choice will be different. The Pinkerton Agency didn't know what to do with this. The agency had been founded 20 years earlier by a Scottish abolitionist named Alan Pinkerton, who had run safe houses on the Underground Railroad, and who, in his younger days, would probably have understood what Jeremiah Walker was doing better than any man alive. But by 1868, Pinkerton had become the chief private police force of the American railroads and Eastern banking interests. His agents in the field were instructed to treat Walker's band as a simple criminal conspiracy, and to bring in its members alive if possible, dead if not. The agency assigned its best man, a former Chicago detective named Patrick Donovan, to coordinate the hunt. Donovan was a hard man, an Irish immigrant who had risen through the agency by being smarter and more ruthless than the men around him, and he understood from the beginning that this would not be an ordinary chase. He arrived at Fort Smith in May of 1868, sat down with the federal marshal there, a former Union general named James Fagan, and asked a single question: how does a man hide 20 riders, 4 of them Comanche, in country where every cattleman, every settler, every passing teamster will report a strange face within a day? Fagan didn't have an answer. Neither did Donovan. The answer, when it finally became apparent 2 years later, would shock the federal government into a level of secrecy that kept the truth out of newspapers for the rest of the century. The answer was that Jeremiah Walker was not hiding. He was being protected by a network of people across 3 states and the Indian Territory who had decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that whatever Jeremiah Walker was doing was something that needed to be done. The first hint of this network came in the summer of 1868, when a Pinkerton informant in the Choctaw town of Dokesville reported that wagons of supplies had been moving in and out of the Comanche Mountains for months with the apparent knowledge and cooperation of the Choctaw Light Horse Police, who were turning a deliberate blind eye. Donovan investigated, found the informant murdered 3 days after he had filed his report. His body left in the middle of the main street of Dokesville with a single playing card pinned to his chest. It was the King of Spades. No one in Dokesville had seen anything. No one knew anything. When Donovan threatened to bring federal troops in, the Choctaw chief, a man named Allen Wright, a graduate of Union College who had once translated the Bible into the Choctaw language, looked at him with the patient contempt of a man who had been dealing with white officials his entire life, and said only that the Choctaw Nation was a sovereign government under the treaties of 1866, that federal troops could not enter without Choctaw consent, and that consent would not be given. The implication was clear. Walker had the protection of the Choctaw government, or at least of enough of its officials to make that protection effective. Donovan returned to Fort Smith and sent a long telegram to Pinkerton headquarters in Chicago. The response from Alan Pinkerton himself, a copy of which survives in the agency's archives, was one of the strangest documents in the history of American law enforcement. It instructed Donovan to proceed with the investigation but to use, quote, particular discretion, end quote, in any actions that might bring the matter to public attention. Pinkerton himself, the old abolitionist, seemed to understand that something complicated was happening on the southwestern frontier. Something that didn't fit neatly in the categories of law and crime. And he was reluctant to bring the full weight of his agency down on it, without first knowing what he would be destroying. If you're still listening to me, and I hope you are, then I want you to take a moment right now to hit that like button, because the algorithm only shows this kind of buried American history to people who actively engage with it, and the families who have spent 150 years trying to keep this story buried have done a very effective job. Every like, every comment, every share helps another person discover what really happened in the territory in the years after the Civil War. And if you have a theory about what was really going on in the Kiamichi Mountains, leave it in the comments, because what we're about to discover is that the truth was stranger and darker than even Patrick Donovan was prepared to imagine. In the autumn of 1868, Walker's band struck again, this time hitting a stagecoach carrying the Choctaw Nation's annuity payment, money the federal government owed the tribe under the Treaty of 1866, and had finally agreed to pay in coin rather than the depreciated paper currency the tribes had learned to refuse. The coach was carrying 19 Zaluters in gold double eagles. It was guarded by a detachment of the 6th United States Cavalry. The cavalry detachment was wiped out. 8 troopers killed in a single volley from rifles fired from positions on both sides of the road, and the gold was taken. But that wasn't what made the robbery famous. What made it famous was what Walker did next. Within 2 weeks, every Choctaw freedman family in the eastern half of the Choctaw Nation had received, by means no investigation could ever quite trace, a small leather pouch containing exactly 20 trillion gold double eagles. There were nearly 700 such families in the affected area. The math worked out almost exactly to the amount stolen, with a small remainder that the freedmen insisted had been used to buy school books for their children. Federal investigators who interviewed these families found, to their fury, that none of the recipients would say a word about who had brought the gold or how it had arrived. The pouches simply appeared on doorsteps in the night. No note, no explanation. When pressed, the freedmen said only that the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and looked at the federal agents with expressions that combined politeness, patience, and a deep, ancient amusement that the agents found impossible to penetrate. Patrick Donovan understood, when he read the reports, exactly what had happened. Walker was not a thief. He was not even, in the conventional sense, an outlaw. He was a redistributor, an inverted Robin Hood operating in a post-war landscape where the federal government had failed in its most basic obligations to the people it had freed, and where the railroads and cattle barons were busily seizing every acre of land and every dollar of wealth they could get their hands on before anyone could organize effective resistance. Walker was the resistance. By the spring of 1869, the band had carried out at least 11 major operations, including the robbery of 2 more railroad payrolls, the looting of a Wells Fargo Express office in Texarkana, the interception of a herd of Texas cattle being driven north to Kansas by a syndicate of speculators who had cheated Comanche families out of their treaty grazing rights, and a daring raid on the Bank of Sherman, Texas, which had foreclosed on dozens of small farms owned by freedmen and Mexican families during the Panic of 1867. The bank's vault was emptied of 41,000. The bank's records, including the foreclosure files, were burned in the street. Within a month, deeds to the foreclosed properties began appearing in the mail of the dispossessed families, accompanied by notarized statements indicating that the bank had reconsidered its position and was returning the land. The notary stamps were forged, but the deeds themselves were genuine. They had been removed from the bank's vault during the robbery, and someone with extensive legal knowledge had transferred them properly through the county recorder's office. Using a clerk who had been bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise persuaded to cooperate, federal authorities tried to challenge the deeds in court. The court, presided over by a judge appointed during Reconstruction and sympathetic to the freedmen, ruled that the transfers were legal on their face and that the federal government had no standing to contest them. The dispossessed families kept their land. The bank, ruined by the loss and the publicity, closed its doors within 6 months. Patrick Donovan, reading the reports in his office at Fort Smith, began to develop what he later described in a private letter to his wife as a peculiar admiration for his quarry, an admiration he found morally troubling and professionally dangerous. He wrote that he had started to understand why Walker had become a kind of folk hero in the territory, why the songs about him sung by black families in the Cotton Bottoms had begun to spread to cattle camps and railroad work crews, why even some white settlers, particularly small farmers and Confederate veterans who had themselves been ruined by the war, were starting to Walker, not as an outlaw, but as a man taking back some small fraction of what had been stolen from everyone who wasn't rich enough to be on the winning side of the new American economy. Donovan understood all of this, and he also understood that his job was to capture or kill Jeremiah Walker, and that his job was not negotiable. In the summer of 1869, Donovan made his first serious attempt. He assembled a force of 40 men, 20 Pinkerton agents, 12 Texas Rangers under the command of a notorious captain named Leander McNelly, and 8 federal marshals from Fort Smith. The force was equipped with New Henry repeating rifles, plenty of ammunition, and the best horses the agency could buy. They had received intelligence from an informant, a freedman named Cyrus Burdett, who had briefly ridden with Walker's band and had been turned by the offer of a federal pardon and 100,000 dollars in cash. That Walker's Maine was a hidden valley in the Comanche Mountains called by the Choctaw the Valley of the Whispering Pines. Accessible only through a single narrow defile that the band kept guarded day and night, Donovan's force rode out from Fort Smith on the morning of June 3, 1869. They were to rendezvous with Burdett at a crossroads near the town of Tuskahoma, where he would lead them by a back route into the valley, bypassing the main defile. They reached the crossroads at dusk. Burdett was waiting for them, sitting against a tree, his hands tied behind his back, his throat cut from ear to ear, his eyes still open. Pinned to his shirt was a playing card. It was the King of Spades. Donovan understood instantly what had happened. Burdett had been doubled. He had pretended to take the federal money while reporting everything he learned back to Walker. Walker had used him to lure the federal force into a trap. Donovan ordered his men to spread out into a defensive perimeter and prepare for an attack. The attack came at moonrise. The moon that night was a 3/4 moon, rising late and bright through the pine tops. The men who survived what happened next would never, afterward, be able to sit comfortably in a dark forest, or hear the sound of horses' hooves on pine needles, or smell wood smoke on a summer night, without feeling the hair on their arms stand up. It came from every direction at once, from positions the band had clearly prepared days in advance, with crossfires that pinned the federal force in a small clearing surrounded by dense timber. The first volley killed 6 men in the space of a single breath, men who had been standing or kneeling,